June 14, 1943, Camp Hearne, Texas. Gefreiter Franz Müller stood in the thin shade beside a wooden barracks and listened to a sound he had never heard in public life at home. A trumpet skated up a bright run, a clarinet laughed, a piano answered with a rolling phrase, and the rhythm section pushed everything forward with a steady, walking pulse that made the gravel under his boots feel lighter. The tune came from a loudspeaker that the guards had set on a crate near the camp canteen, a set that crackled at first and then cleared as a technician in a khaki shirt twisted a knob. Franz watched the hands around him still in mid-motion, as men carrying crates or sweeping the yard paused without thinking and turned their faces the way a field of sunflowers will turn toward the morning. He had heard American music before the war only in whispers and private gatherings. In Germany, the radio had offered martial songs and approved light music, and the teachers at his school had warned that jazz was corrupt and foreign. Yet here in the heat of a Texas afternoon, he felt the music tug at his breath like a friendly hand. The clarinet took a little blue turn, and the trumpeter bent a note that seemed to wobble like heat above a road, and he did what so many around him were doing without instruction. He smiled. The camp around him was part of a vast system that had taken shape with American speed. By mid-1943, the United States held hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners on its own soil, spread across more than 400 camps and branch camps in over 40 states. Camp Hearne, built in a matter of weeks, held several thousand men in long rows of wooden barracks with electric light and running water. The prisoner of war program worked under the laws of the Geneva Convention, and within that framework, the American command pursued a policy that mixed discipline with exposure to ordinary life. The Special Projects Division within the office of the Provost Marshal General would later formalize that approach with language about education and democratic values. But in June, the policy felt like something simpler and more immediate. Allow men to work in fields and canneries. Allow them to read newspapers. Allow controlled access to radio programs that reached every corner of the country, and let reality make its own case. Radio ownership had grown across the United States in the 1930s, until families in cities and towns treated nightly broadcasts like a public hearth. Networks fed programs to affiliate stations, and by the time Franz stood in that yard, the Armed Forces radio service was sending shows like Command Performance and GI Jive to bases and ships, to barracks and outposts, and sometimes by way of recorded discs, to prisoner enclosures as well. The artists who drew the largest audiences were men like Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw on clarinet, Count Basie and Duke Ellington at the piano, and the Army Air Force Band led by Glenn Miller, whose music had a polish that came from drilled precision and a deep love of swing. Those names meant nothing to Franz that first afternoon. He knew only that the drum brushes whispered like wind on canvas and the bass line marched more gently than any column he had known, and that the room of his heart felt larger. He stood with his back to the wall and tried to put the sound into the categories that had guided his life since conscription. What he saw did not match any of them. The guards did not stamp or strut. One of them, a young man with freckles and an accent from somewhere far to the east, nodded to the beat and made a little circle with his finger in the air when the piano player on the radio took a turn. A cook appeared in the open door of the kitchen with a towel thrown over his shoulder and leaned his shoulder against the frame and listened. A chaplain in a short-sleeved shirt walked by with a box of pamphlets and paused, then set the box down and listened with the rest. When the song ended, there was a small stir, and another tune began that had a simple rising figure, then a break, then a lift like a soft cheer. Franz felt the line of his back relax against the boards. The old words about degenerate rhythms and jungle music did not stand up under the sun. He had grown up with Schubert songs at his mother's piano and band music in town squares, and now this new sound used a different grammar to do an old thing. It was inviting men to stand together, to feel at the same time, to recognize each other with a nod and a grin. He looked at the faces near him and saw a mechanic from the Ruhr who had lost weight in Africa, and a former student from Hamburg with intelligent eyes, and a miller with hands like shovels. He saw that each one had allowed his features to soften. He thought of the last official concert he had attended before capture, a stiff evening in which the conductor had scolded latecomers from the podium and the ushers had cracked their knuckles like nightsticks. The contrast felt like a private joke that the air itself had told. That afternoon, the music reached beyond the wire through the relay of American habit. The camp command had a schedule on a clipboard that listed work details, meal hours, guard rotations, and recreation blocks. And in those open hours, the staff put on programs that they thought would calm a large body of men and keep tempers even. Jazz and popular music did that job better than lectures. The country around the camp ran on electricity and machines and a rhythm of shifts in mills and plants, and the air was full of sound so constant that many Americans could name favorite bands with the same ease that they named baseball teams. The nation pressed steel and rubber and gasoline into instruments of war, yet its citizens carried on with rituals that felt to Franz both ordinary and astonishing. Thousands of cinemas showed newsreels in the early part of the evening, and then comedies or romances, and on Saturday afternoons, a boy could hear a game from St. Louis or Chicago while his father worked under a car. The scale matched the numbers that were written each month in the statements of production. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles out of Detroit and Willow Run. Millions of tons of cargo across the Atlantic and the Pacific. Tens of millions of records pressed, and more sheet music than Franz could imagine spread across upright pianos in parlors and schoolrooms. The music that came through that crate speaker was part of a much larger engine. It oiled spirits, it pulled strangers into a common beat, and in the end, it helped make the system feel inevitable to those who lived inside it, and bewildering to those who had not believed such things were possible. In the evening, Franz wrote in his pocket notebook and left the paper between the mattress and the wood slats so that the duty sergeant would not see it. He did not write the sensitive words that had gotten other men sent to punishment cells when found. He wrote about sound. He wrote that the drummer in the first number used sticks for the chorus and brushes for the verse. He wrote that the trumpet in the second number had smiled with the mouthpiece, and that he had heard the smile across 30 yards of yard and static. He wrote about a chord that the pianist had placed under the clarinet like a cushion. He wrote that when the station break came, a female announcer with a warm voice read the time in a way that made the hour feel friendly, and that he had not heard a public voice address strangers with that kind of ease since the days before his country turned inward. Then he stopped and listened to the barracks settle. The men around him were quiet. Someone far away shouted in a language he did not know. A freight train moaned across the night. He thought of the trip that had brought him to Texas and the days in the Atlantic when the ship's crew had played records on the mess deck. He realized that he had heard something like this then, and that he had been too numb to notice. Heat and routine and the safety of a bed had loosened the knot in his chest enough to let sound enter. The next day, he found himself sweeping near the same corner when another program came on, and the guard with freckles joined him with a broom and said, "You can stop during the songs." Franz looked at him and nodded and tried to form the English word that would not sound like a threat or a plea. "Thank you," he said, and the guard gave him a little wink that did not feel superior. The announcer named the Glenn Miller Army Air Force Band, and the tune that followed had reeds that moved like one instrument and a trombone section that landed on notes as neat as a block of wood cut by a sharp saw. The brass had power and restraint. The drummer kept time with a ride pattern that sounded like light rain on a roof. When a saxophone stepped forward for a short break, the camp yard gave a soft murmur that would have been a whistle and a shout if this had been a dance hall. In the barrack that night, the talk took a new turn. Men argued about whether the tight precision of the service band was better than the rougher joy of the small group that had played first. A young man from Munich who had worked in a record shop before the draft said that he had once sold a Duke Ellington record to a customer with careful hands, and that the man had come back the next week for Count Basie. The memory made him blush, as if he had told a tale about a woman. Franz saw that the way these men spoke about music loosened something in their thinking. They ranked and compared and praised and teased, and the habitual words about strength and purity that had governed their talk in Africa did not appear. The camp remained a camp with wire and watchtowers and orders, but within that frame a small room had opened. Outside the fence, the war ground forward with a scale that the radio could measure in numbers and names. In North Africa, the surrender in May had transferred hundreds of thousands of prisoners into Allied hands. Ships that carried tanks and food one way brought men back the other way. And in the summer, those ships crossed the Atlantic in great lines under air cover and with improved convoy tactics that drove losses down. Inland, the river of trains that supported the American war effort ran day and night. The same rails that brought prisoners to Texas also carried wheat and cattle, bales of cotton, barrels of oil, crates of machine parts and radio parts, and carloads of records that went to jukebox operators who serviced diners, bars, and drugstores from Virginia to California. The broadcasting networks built their schedules with both civilians and service members in mind. Popular programs offered cheerful sound between news bulletins that carried the weight of the fronts. When a major event came, coverage widened to fill every channel. In that environment, jazz was not a side note. It was one of the ways the country recognized itself in a public mirror. In cities like New York and Chicago, clubs ran 3 shows a night for crowds who worked shifts, and union rules shaped set lengths and pay scales so that a young trumpet player could survive. The industry around those clubs fed a growing national appetite. Labels cut records in numbers that rose with each quarter. Radio bands moved between hotel ballrooms and studios. Touring circuits reached new towns that wartime manufacturing had swollen. The Armed Forces Radio Service cut transcriptions on large discs and shipped them to bases and ships and, by permission, to camps. The physical scale of that production matched the scale of the tank plants and aircraft plants in a way that many Americans did not notice and that many prisoners could not believe. Franz learned the shape of the day by the times the loudspeaker came alive. Work party returns gave him the early afternoon. After supper, there might be a half-hour of music and a half-hour of a dramatic serial that did not interest him. On Sunday, there was more music between chapel hours and football. He stopped trying to remember song titles and started to listen for the way a band introduced a melody, the way the rhythm section marked the second chorus, the way a soloist quoted a familiar tune inside a new one, and made a joke that only people who knew both would catch. He found that even in captivity, the mind could learn with pleasure. He also began to notice the faces of the guards when certain songs came on. A tall sergeant from Oklahoma softened when a slow ballad floated out like a long breath, and a corporal from New York braced and brightened when a fast number kicked in. The music was a web that caught both sides and held them in the same wind for a few minutes at a time. When a church choir from town came to sing one evening in the recreation hall, and the director surprised everyone by closing with a spiritual that carried the rise and fall of call and response, Franz felt a hush move through the ranks at the back of the room, and then an applause that was not polite but grateful. He had heard the word for the style in a lesson from one of the camp educators who taught English phrases in the afternoon. He remembered that this music came from a history that his own country had used for mockery and hate. He did not feel mockery in his chest now. He felt a pull to understand. The camp library began to stock thin pamphlets and magazines that described American life in simple words. Franz checked out a small book about the history of the blues and another about the life of the great band leaders. He learned that the music he heard had grown from many sources, from brass bands and church choirs, from piano players who worked in crowded bars near Mississippi docks, from string bands in country towns and singers in city theaters. He read that the record industry had made fortunes and had also cheated the artists who made the sounds, and that musicians had formed unions to win fair pay. He read that names censored in Germany as foreign agitators were here public figures who stood on stages before thousands without fear. He did not know what to do with this yet. He carried the books back and forth and kept listening. In his notebook, he wrote the word America, and then he stared at it. During his school days, the word had meant a place of chaos. During his training, the word had meant an enemy with weak limbs and a soft heart. Now the word pressed on him with numbers. Millions of listeners, tens of thousands of bands and singers and arrangers, hundreds of stations, ships so steady that a jazz record could roll across the mess table and not skip. He looked at the page and put the notebook away and went to sleep. One weekend, the guards allowed a German band to assemble instruments that had come through the Red Cross and through the kindness of local citizens. A violin, an accordion, a trumpet with a dent near the bell, a clarinet that squeaked until its player warmed, the reed, a drum kit that had been cobbled together from a snare, a bass drum that looked newly painted, and a cymbal that wobbled as if it had been rescued from a storm. The men who played were not famous, but they had ears, and over weeks of listening, they had learned the feel of the swing they heard from the loudspeaker. They began with a march out of habit, then set the march aside and tried a simple blues. The first chorus felt stiff, the second relaxed. By the third, the drummer had found a steady ride pattern, and the bass player, a farmer from Saxony who had never held such an instrument until that day, began to walk with a confidence that surprised him. The trumpet leaned into a note, and the clarinet sang across the top, and the men at the back tables tapped their cups on the boards in time. The guard with freckles sat on the edge of the stage and watched with his hands clasped. Franz did not play an instrument, but when the band leader asked for a singer for a simple tune with a short lyric, he heard his own voice say yes before he had thought it through. He stood behind the microphone that had been borrowed from the chapel and felt the wood floor under his boots and sang the words as plainly as he could, without ornament, and the room held him up. When he finished, he could not speak for a moment. The band went on. A guard fetched a harmonica and made a sound that came from some place older than the war and larger than the wire. The men clapped for him, too. When the night ended, the drummer counted 3 beats and hit the cymbal on 4, and the sound shivered like a page turned in a big book. What Franz could not see yet was that scenes like this were repeating in many camps, and that the pattern would have consequences that reached far beyond any one fence line. Across the country, men who had been told that jazz was unfit for civilized people were hearing it every week, were playing it with borrowed instruments, were sending guarded letters home that described the sound in lines that the sensors did not always catch, and were forming in their heads a new map of the world. The American command measured this sentiment in small ways. Fewer fights after music nights. More requests to borrow English readers with song lyrics. Volunteers for farm work where country stations played swing and blues from dawn to dusk. Pastors in small towns who wrote to the camp and said that their congregations wished to host choirs and that the prisoners had sung with good cheer. A Red Cross worker in a dusty county office who wrote that she had delivered a set of records to a camp and that the men had said thank you in careful English and that one had cried without shame. The numbers did not appear in official communiques the way ship tonnage and aircraft counts did. But the trend line existed all the same. A quiet, upward curve of human ease. Near the end of June, after a day in a cotton field where the heat seemed to rise from the soil in waves, Franz was part of a small group driven by truck through a town whose main street held a diner with a jukebox visible through the window. The truck idled while the driver waited for a signal from the escort car ahead. The jukebox lights made a bright column in the dim room. For a long moment the door swung open as a boy in a white cap carried a crate to the back, and a clear chorus spilled into the street. It floated over gasoline and hot tar and the sour smell of sweat. Franz saw a woman at the counter nod to the time with a pencil in her hand, and a man behind the grill move his shoulder while he flipped a burger. Then the door closed, and the truck rolled forward, and they were gone. That small slice of life felt hotter in his pocket than any contraband. He touched it from time to time the way a devotee will touch a relic. At Camp Hearne, the guards allowed the loudspeaker to run a program on Saturday night that ran late. Franz sat on the steps with two comrades who had worked in a factory together before the war, and now shared cigarettes with the care of men who knew exactly how many were left in the pack. The program host spoke with a friendly authority and introduced a new record that he said had climbed the charts. The charts meant little to Franz, but the piano that entered did. It played with an elastic time that pulled and released and seemed to fold the room around the melody. The band rose behind it with a sweetness that did not hide strength. The three men did not speak until the record ended, and then the one from the factory sighed and said a single word that was not in any of the vocabulary lists taped on the classroom wall. Home. He did not mean Germany or America. He meant a room in which men and women from many places could find a common chair and a common tune long enough to breathe without armor. Franz lay awake later and watched the shadows cross the ceiling and felt that he had been handed a bit of country on a plate. He did not know how he would carry it when the war moved again. He thought only that he must keep listening, keep noticing, keep writing the small notations that would give him back the path later. The trumpet had gone up and come down and left a little echo. He tried to hear the echo again and smiled in the dark. The morning of June 20th, 1943, began with laundry steam breathing out of the wash shed and the steady murmur of men in line. And then the loudspeaker cleared to a cheerful female voice that seemed to smile as it spoke. Franz Müller paused with a burlap sack in his hands and listened as the announcer said her name, Jill, and told the boys she had a stack of hot records just for them. He did not know until later that millions of Americans and hundreds of thousands of servicemen knew her as G.I. Jill from the program G.I. Jive, a show sent out by the Armed Forces radio service that had started the year before in California. What he knew in the moment was that her tone made the yard feel friendly. She cued a record, and Count Basie's piano dropped in like a soft hammer. Then a riff rose from the reeds, and the rhythm tightened until the air itself seemed to keep time. Franz felt a small lift inside his ribs, the same lift that had surprised him a week earlier. The guard with freckles finished a note on a clipboard, set his pencil behind his ear, and said to no one in particular that the Basie band could swing a barn off its foundation. The phrase made no literal sense to Franz, and yet he understood it. The tune ended, Jill read a few letters, and then she spun one by the Glenn Miller Army Air Force Band, and the blend of clarinets and saxophones came in so smooth that men nearby breathed out as if a door had opened. Through the rest of the day, while he stacked clean shirts on a table and folded towels, Franz heard snatches of melody through the open window and learned that American radio did not bark orders. It invited. At noon, the program cut to a news bulletin about heavy fighting around Pantelleria, the small island in the Mediterranean that had fallen earlier in June after a concentrated air bombardment. The announcer read casualty figures with a steady voice and then handed the hour back to music. Franz stored that turn in his head, the way the report had bridged back into a tune. It felt like a description of the country he was inside. Work everywhere, war everywhere, and alongside both, a patient supply of diversion that seemed to rebuild the heart between alarms. The scale of that diversion had grown with a speed that matched the war effort itself. The Armed Forces Radio Service, created in 1942 under the leadership of officers and engineers who understood both transmitters and morale, sent thousands of recorded programs each month to bases, ships, and camps. It fed live network shows down landlines and shortwave to every time zone where American uniforms stood post, and it pressed transcriptions, large discs cut at 33 1/3 revolutions, for places where lines did not reach. In the summer of 1943, the service began to ship a new kind of record called a V-disc, made through a special agreement with the American Federation of Musicians. A recording strike had shut down most commercial sessions since August 1942, but the union's leader, James Petrillo, allowed sessions for V-discs on the condition that they would not be sold in stores and that they would be used only for the forces. That exemption worked. Benny Goodman recorded for the program. Duke Ellington recorded. Louis Armstrong recorded. Ensembles came into studios in New York and Los Angeles to cut sides for the men overseas and for the men confined in places like Camp Hearne. In the same months, the United Service Organizations booked live bands and singers into thousands of small auditoriums and gymnasiums, and in the largest cities, the broadcast networks aired series that became evening rituals. Command performance went out on Sundays, with a mix of comedy, big band features, and requests sent from units with strange names and numbers. Jubilee carried the best of African American bands and singers, and many white service members listened because the music was fresh, even as the country still kept separate barracks and mess halls in many places. The contradiction did not disappear just because the music was bright. The documentary record makes that plain. In Texas in 1943, separate seating and separate service windows ruled many town businesses, and African American soldiers worked and fought in units that did not mix with whites. Yet when a Jubilee transcription found its way to a camp loudspeaker, the horn shout that opened a Lionel Hampton number did not stop to check the legal color line. It jumped the wire as if the law did not exist. Franz could not name all of this, but he felt it. He felt it when he heard a blues singer tell a story in 12 steady bars that climbed from trouble to a kind of ease. He felt it when a clarinet climbed over a cushion of reeds and then resolved as neatly as a prayer. In the last week of June, the work detail took Franz to a tomato packing shed 20 miles from the camp. The shed manager showed the men how to stack crates, and a small battery radio on a shelf by the scale shared space with a coffee pot and a tin of sugar. The radio brought in a local station from the nearest city, and the announcer between songs read weather and crop prices, then said that the Cotton Bowl in Dallas had hosted an audience of more than 20,000 for a war bond rally the night before, where a military band played a medley that the paper called a patriotic swing. Franz listened to the numbers. 20,000 at a rally for bonds. He pictured the stadium seats filled and a band on the field under lights that did not flicker. At the end of the shift, the manager thumbed through a stack of paper, counted out the day's pay for the camp labor fund, and handed the guard a receipt with neat figures. In the truck on the ride back, the men spoke in clipped phrases about what they had heard. One had worked in a small cinema in Bremen. One had played violin in a town ensemble that gave concerts in the park. They were not the men they had been in Africa 3 months earlier, and the difference showed in small ways. They compared bass lines. They argued about reed tone. They did not say who was racially fit for culture or who was not. Back in the barracks that evening, the camp educator, a teacher from Heidelberg, who had been identified by the Americans as anti-Nazi and placed in charge of a small cultural club, read from a slim article that summarized events in American music since the late 1920s. He spoke of the 1938 Carnegie Hall concert, where Benny Goodman's band had played to a sold-out house and shown that a dance style could fill a temple of serious music. He mentioned Duke Ellington's extended work from 1940 that critics had called a tone parallel to Harlem. He stressed that these artists had been known in Europe before the war, but that wartime radio had widened their audiences inside the United States to levels that surprised even the musicians. The teacher took questions until lights out. Franz asked none. He only listened, and he stored the names. On July 4, 1943, the camp command marked the American holiday with a baseball game between guards and a unit from a nearby army depot, lemonade in big tubs of ice, and a concert in the recreation hall that ran until the mosquitoes found every ankle in the building. Franz watched the flag go up at morning colors and noticed that the musicians who warmed up at the back of the hall before the program included 2 men from a black service unit who had been allowed inside the perimeter as guests. He could tell from the first tuning notes that they were professionals. The trumpeter set a bright A, the tenor saxophone found the center of the pitch with a quick bend, and when the drummer tested his ride cymbal, the sound hung in the shop air like a new coin. The guards gave a short introduction, thanked the depot, and stepped back. The small group began with a medium blues and moved to a popular song from a Broadway show, then took a request for a waltz from a white sergeant's wife who had come in with a group of visitors. By the second chorus, men on both sides of the room were moving their shoulders without knowing they were doing it. Between numbers, the trumpeter said that the big news would break soon in the Mediterranean, and some in the room already knew that Allied forces were concentrating for the move into Sicily that would begin on July 10th. The band pushed into a faster tune, and the tenor player lifted a chorus that rose and then landed true, and the room applauded with real warmth. Franz sat very still and tried to fix the feeling in words he could write later. A minute after the last song, an officer stepped to the front and read the day's casualty roll from the camp hospital. 3 men ill with heat stroke, 1 sent to a larger facility for treatment of a chest condition, then thanked the visitors again. Outside, fireworks from town flickered on the horizon. The German band that had been forming in the camp put away its pieces with care, utterly quiet, each man thoughtful. Franz walked back to the barrack and wrote that the tenor player had played a phrase in which the notes seemed to lean on each other, like friends walking. He added that no one had told anyone to feel that way. It had simply happened in the air. The week after the holiday began with work in the tomato shed again, and by the second day, Franz Müller found himself moving with the rhythm of the station that the manager kept tuned in above the scale. The announcer gave farm reports and read small notices from the county seat, then let records run in pairs. When a voice came on that said "Hello, fellas" in warm English that even he could understand, Franz glanced up and smiled without meaning to. The name G.I. Jill was clear now, and the way she threaded a letter from a unit in North Africa into a request for a Count Basie side felt as careful as a hand sewing two cloths together. On breaks, the American workers shared coffee and let the prisoners stand in the shade. One brought a harmonica and played a simple tune that the others clapped for. The guard with freckles stood back and watched. Franz noted how the music softened edges that had scraped a month before. In the evening, he sat on the barrack steps and listened to a different program, a transcription of Jubilee that the camp staff had borrowed from a nearby base. The host's voice ran smooth and fast and introduced a Lionel Hampton number with a bright drum intro that made men lean forward with the first bar. The trumpet section shouted on cue, and the vibraphone rose like a row of spoons struck by sunlight, and in the back of the room a long murmur went through men who had never heard such sparkle put to work. The program closed with a blues that told a small story with plain words and strong feeling. Franz walked out under a clear Texas sky and tried to name what he felt. It was not only pleasure. It was surprise at the human voice finding strength without orders. He slept with that thought and woke with it still on his tongue. Beyond the wire, the war moved into a new phase. On July 10, 1943, the Allied forces landed in Sicily in Operation Husky, with a fleet and air cover on a scale that newspapers called historic. The radio at the shed reported that more than 2,000 ships and landing craft were involved, and that paratroopers had dropped in the night to seize key roads. The announcer described wind conditions and the difficulty of several drops as if he were reading a weather summary for farms. Between bulletins, the station ran dance music. In the camp, the Special Projects Division continued to build its program of education and morale by routine rather than flourish. English classes added short readings about American life. The library received pamphlets with photographs of bands in clean halls and of grinning couples on the floor at hotel ballrooms. When Franz turned the pages, he felt as if he were walking past a row of windows that showed a house inside which many rooms were lit at once. He began to realize that this music had been part of American evenings since before the war, and that the country had not put it on simply for prisoners or for soldiers. This was how the country spent time together. That fact worked on him slowly. A loud voice could be faked for effect. A habit that ran through every county fair and town broadcast could not. When the news came on July 22nd that Palermo had fallen and that units were pushing east toward Messina in heat that made machinery sweat, the station read the report and then played a slow ballad. A cook in the shed hummed along while washing a tray. The pairing of news and music did not seem to make sense until Franz accepted the idea that the hours had to hold both weight and relief if they were to carry people through a long war. On the ride back to the camp, he looked at the line of freight cars on a siding and thought of how much grain would move along that track in a day and how many records would ship in the same hour in the same direction. The scale of production did not exclude feeling. It included it. The camp band that had taken shape in June grew steadier. A chaplain helped them get a better cymbal and a set of reeds and some manuscript paper. The man from Munich, who had worked in a record shop before the war, wrote out simple parts in pencil and copied them by hand, and the bass player learned to keep a steady line with just enough bounce that men at the rear tables nodded without thinking. On a Saturday night in mid-July, the Guards allowed a short program in the recreation hall that paired the German group with a small unit from the depot that had visited on the holiday. The Americans arrived in work khaki with cases and a smile, set up without fuss, and opened the evening with a warm, medium tune. The drummer's ride cymbal whispered like rain on a roof, and the tenor saxophone found notes that sat squarely in the center of pitch. When the visitors asked the camp group to come up and play a number, the room held its breath. The German trumpet stepped forward, took a simple melody, and kept to it without fear. Behind him, the pianist found gentle chords. Franz sat 2 rows back and watched the eyes on the stage. He saw how the visiting drummer leaned in to catch the time, and how the German bass player listened hard enough to sweat. The tune ended to real applause. That night, after lights out, a young man from the Ruhr said in the dark that he had never felt so far from the slogans he had once repeated, and that a certain kind of lie could not live in the same room with a simple, honest beat. The barrack was quiet then. No one needed to add anything. At the end of July, the news bulletins began to speak openly about the weakening of Italian resolve and the pressure inside Rome. Franz heard the report on July 25th that Mussolini had been removed from power and that General Badoglio had taken control, and he watched the guard with freckles read the printed bulletin twice before pinning it to a board. The camp ran under clear rules. No one cheered an enemy's trouble in a way that would sting. Yet the atmosphere shifted. In English class, a teacher said in a gentle voice that armies moved on rail schedules, but that public hearts moved on songs. He wrote a list of titles on the blackboard and asked the men to raise hands for the numbers they had learned to like. Franz raised his hand for a tune he could not pronounce well and laughed with the others at his own attempt. That evening, a V-disc reached the camp from the nearby airfield. Its label carried a session date in early summer and the names of players who had cut aside for the service. The engineer at the camp set the disc on the turntable and lowered the needle with a little ceremony. The opening chorus was neat and happy. The trumpet spoke in short phrases that felt like smiles. The song ran just under 4 minutes and ended with a clean tag. In the quiet that followed, a man near the front said that he had started to count the bars and had lost track because his foot had taken over. A small laugh ran through the room. Franz wrote one sentence that night before he slept. He wrote that after everything that had happened, the music still found its way into corners that the war had not reached, and that he needed to keep that fact alive in his chest, as if it were a coal that would light again when touched by air. The month that followed began with work in fields farther from the camp, and the trucks rolled before dawn to beat the heat. The summer of 1943 was hard on the men who worked outside, but the farmers treated the prisoners as hands rather than as enemies. Radios sat near pumps and barns and windows, and stations from a chain in the nearest city turned steady. In the midday shade, workers shared cold water and news. A farmer brought out a stack of old magazines that had photographs of bands on stages with lights like polished coins. And one issue had a story about the way a drummer named Gene Krupa had brought fire to a hall with a long drum feature before the war. The photograph showed a face set in effort, but not grim, and sticks held above a snare that looked like snow in a spotlight. In the back of the magazine, a column listed band routes for the month. Cities that Franz had only seen on maps were set in a sequence that looked like a railway schedule for joy. He tried to imagine what it would feel like to sit at a small table with a glass of something sweet and listen to that much sound moving through space so fast that it left a trail like a comet. He turned the page and saw a short note about Glenn Miller and the Army Air Force Band traveling to play for units that were staging for far larger operations that would come later. He felt how the music ran like a thread sewn into the cloth of military life so closely that men would look for it when they lifted the cloth to check the weave. When the guards returned the group to the camp, the evening brought a bulletin about fighting across the Strait of Messina, a short casualty list, and then a song with a clarinet lead so smooth that it felt like cool water on a burned hand. In early September, the night brought a broadcast that drew men to the loudspeaker without anyone calling for assembly. On September 8, 1943, Italy announced an armistice. The announcer read the statement and then added notes about German units moving to disarm Italian formations in various regions. The camp stayed quiet. No one in authority wished to see a display that would make later days more tense. The next morning, the work detail took Franz near the rail yard, where he watched long strings of hopper cars loaded with coal rumble, under cranes that moved without hurry. A locomotive breathed out a steady column of smoke that frayed into blue above the yard. The yard office had a radio, and a man in overalls kept the set low while he tallied figures in a ledger. The song that came on was a ballad, sung by a woman with a voice that moved carefully from word to word, as if each one were a foot placed on a stone in a slow river. Franz could not understand every phrase, but he recognized the climb to a high note and the soft descent, and he saw the yard clerk pause with his pencil above a column and then smile without thinking. In the truck on the ride back to camp, a comrade from Bavaria said that the whole country seemed to breathe in time with the music, and that he had not seen that kind of unity in a long time. Another man said that unity achieved by fear did not feel like unity at all. Franz sat with that and did not speak. He thought of what the teacher in the camp had said about public hearts. When the first cool nights came, the camp band tried a new number that had a bridge with a line that stepped up sweetly and then came home. The clarinetist found the pitch only on the second try, and the drummer laughed and tapped his sticks together and counted them in again. The room applauded when the line landed clean. A guard at the back let the corner of his mouth rise. The small signs mattered more than large speeches. Franz began to keep a small list in his notebook. He wrote that the camp had received 7 discs in the last 2 weeks, and that 3 had been Jubilee, and 2 had been programs from Hollywood, and 2 had been recorded medleys from service bands on tour. He wrote that the men had walked out calmer after music nights, and that men in the canteen line had hummed while they waited, and that guards had stopped snapping at small errors. He did not draw a conclusion. He knew only that the trend matched what he could feel in his own chest. The music did not erase hard facts. It changed the way men bore them. At the end of September, a visiting chaplain offered to host a discussion in the recreation hall about American music and asked if the band would play short examples between remarks. He began with a simple explanation of how a 12-bar blues worked and how a band could move through the shape while making new lines on top. He asked the pianist to play the form alone, then with bass and drums, and then with the horn players sitting in one by one. The sound grew in clear steps. He then played a transcription of a Duke Ellington side from a few years earlier, in which the band had spread color like paint, section behind section, until the whole canvas filled. He did not use complex words. He said that this was a language that had grown inside the country, and that it belonged to many kinds of people at once. He smiled and added that the country was still learning how to live up to its own best sounds. The room was quiet for a moment, and then men nodded in a way that said they understood the difference between a claim and an honest hope. Afterward, a few guards came forward with questions about the drums and the reeds. The band packed up slowly in a mood that was not solemn and not careless. Franz stood to the side and watched. He realized that the music had given them a way to stand in the same room without lies. As autumn moved in, the Armed Forces radio service widened its reach. New sets arrived at distant outposts and camp recreation rooms, and shipments of V-discs continued. The strike that had halted much commercial recording remained in effect for the general market through late 1943, but the special agreement for service records kept the pipeline full. In a warehouse in New York, crews packed boxes with dozens of discs and sent them out with routing slips that read like maps of the war. Franz learned this in pieces from an article that the camp library received and from a staff sergeant who liked to talk while setting up the phonograph. The sergeant had been a sound man for a small theater at home and spoke with affection about needles and platters and labels. He showed Franz how to wipe a record with a clean cloth held flat and how to lower a tone arm with a steady hand. He explained that the grooves carried a little hill and valley that the needle rode and turned into sound. Franz thought of ridges in a field and rain running down them and smiled at the idea that a farm image could help him understand a machine. He asked how many discs the service made in a month, and the sergeant said that the numbers changed, but that the stacks were high enough to fill a railcar and that the railcar left often. The idea that a train could carry music the way it carried grain or steel made Franz happy in a way he did not try to hide. One Sunday afternoon in October, the camp got permission to bring in a small group from the city for a concert that would be short and careful. The group was mixed in age and came with a piano player whose left hand kept time like a clock and whose right hand danced like a child at a festival. The singer was a woman from a church choir with a clear alto. She sang a hymn and then, at the request of the guard with freckles, a popular ballad that had run up the charts the previous spring. Franz listened hard to the way she shaped the vowels. The words were in a language that he was learning, but the feeling in the vowels needed no translation. When the group closed with a tune that had a gentle lilt, the room did not stir until the last note had settled. Afterward, the visitors accepted lemonade at a back table, and the piano player shook hands with men who had lined up to say thank you. The handshake line did not look like a line at a camp. It looked like a line at a small town hall where neighbors greet guests after a recital. That night, Franz wrote a longer entry, careful to use simple sentences. He wrote that the country had decided to throw sound at fear, and that sound had done some of the work that words could not do. He added that he did not know what the next months would bring, and that the news would surely be hard, but that he believed the music would keep the rooms from feeling narrow. He closed the book and slept with ease for the first time in a week. The first cold front came in late October, and the air at Camp Hearne felt clean when Franz Müller stepped out of the barrack before dawn. He pulled his jacket close and saw that a pale line of cloud stood above the eastern trees like a low wall. The work party rolled out with the usual clatter, and the truck rattled past a water tower where a town name was painted in large letters. At the tomato shed, the radio on the shelf was already talking. The announcer mentioned school football games, county fairs, and a charity supper at a church where a service band would play a set of popular songs. Then the station cut to a record with a slow saxophone lead and a cushion of reeds. Franz moved crates and listened to the way the melody landed like a bird on a branch and then lifted for another turn. At lunch, the manager set the pot of coffee beside the scale and turned the knob until a familiar voice came up clear. G.I. Jill read a letter from a unit with a number that sounded like a long code, and then said she had a treat from the Carnegie Hall maestro of swing. The side that followed had a neat drive and a smiling clarinet and a brass section that opened like a curtain. Franz felt again that odd sense that the music sorted his thoughts and arranged them on a shelf where he could see them. He remembered the evening in the recreation hall when the small city group had played with grace, and he felt that same ease now, only with a brighter edge. Back at the camp, the teacher in the club room spoke about autumn concerts in New York and Chicago, and said that bands were touring hard to raise money for bond drives and service charities. He mentioned the number of tickets punched in one week across a handful of states, and the figures made the men whistle under their breath. Hundreds of thousands of seats filled by people who wanted to sit in a room together and let a beat hold them for an hour. In the barrack that night, Franz wrote that the drum stroke in the middle chorus of the last tune had felt like a light knock at a familiar door. He tried to explain the feeling in simple words. The explanation did not arrive. The feeling remained. The broader rhythm of the world pushed forward with dates that stamped themselves in memory. In early November, newspapers carried maps of the Italian front and spoke of the slow climb north in rain and mud. Stations read the names of places that would soon carry deep meaning: Naples, the Volturno, San Pietro. Between those reports, the Armed Forces radio service pushed out more music. The V-disc program had taken full shape by autumn, and the numbers were large. By the end of the year, millions of special pressings were on their way to bases, ships, and camps, with thousands of masters cut by bands that had set aside commercial work to give the forces something fresh. The labels carried recording dates and the names of soloists, and engineers learned to pack the boxes so that the discs would ride better on rails and trucks. In the camp office, a sergeant explained to Franz that the records came from New York by way of a distribution point, and that a portion was held at the nearby airfield for loan to the camp. He showed him a routing slip with columns for departure and arrival, and noted that the lines for this traffic were as neat as any other line in a supply system that never slept. The sergeant allowed Franz to hold a disc under supervision for a moment. Franz felt the weight and the faint, chalky smell and thought of grain sacks in a mill. In the recreation hall that week, a new transcription of Jubilee arrived. The host introduced a song by Louis Jordan that bounced like a ball on a hard floor, and the room laughed at the sly words, even when the meaning slipped past a few ears. Then a blues singer told a small story about a train at midnight, and the men leaned in as if the car itself had rolled into the room. Franz listened and remembered the yard clerk who had paused with his pencil above the ledger while a ballad played at low volume. He saw how these scenes connected in a line that ran across fields and towns and bases. The country was huge, and yet a tune could move across it faster than a train and leave a mark that lasted longer than a printed line on a schedule. That thought stayed with him when the news came from the Mediterranean that ships were being routed to support landings that would push the line north again. The nights grew cooler, and the camp band met in the recreation hall more often, glad for a roof. They worked on a simple arrangement of a song that had charted the year before. The man from Munich wrote out the parts, and the drummer practiced a soft shuffle that made the melody sit just right. The chaplain stopped by with a kind word and a small box of new reeds. One evening, a teacher from the Special Projects Division drove in from a larger post to observe. He wore a plain uniform and a quiet manner, and he listened with his arms folded and a small smile. After the tune ended, he thanked the men for the work and spoke for 15 minutes without flourish about radio, records, and the way a nation learns the same songs.